Okay, people. 3 hours on the examination, usual rules, and due at the beginning of class next Wednesday. I ask you please to observe the spirit of the rule by not trying to read the thing through the envelope. It's not exactly morally kosher. And today should be our last day on this European tradition, 19th, 20th century European. And of course the examination covers through Sartre. Optional discussion, Monday, 7 o'clock. Is that good? As good as any time is good? If it's impossible for you, then stop by the office Tuesday, 10:30, thereabouts in the morning. I'll probably be in the office most of the morning on Tuesday. Okay. And what we want to do today is to talk about some other recent phenomenology other than Sartre. And the first two I want to mention because they are, among other things, responding directly to Sartre. Gabriel Marcel is a French Catholic philosopher, one of those that I called a religious existentialist, though he renounced the term existentialist because of its associations and called himself a philosopher of existence, trying to avoid the connotations. And Marcel does quite a lot in describing the phenomenology of interpersonal relationships, the phenomenology of hope. Interesting, hope. Yeah, that sort of theme. His complaint about Sartre is that his dialectic between the for itself and the in itself is just overdrawn. The idea of a constant negation, whereby the one always negates the other. There's always alienation. Fails to distinguish, according to Marcel, between negation and simply disengagement. When there is no act of turning against or overcoming the other, it's simply a drifting apart. And so the dialectic then is exaggerated and the resultant picture is distorted. His point is that in any kind of relationship, there are two poles that are possible: alienation and love. And in between those two poles, the relationship may move to and fro. But it's not all alienation. It's not all vehement antithesis. So Marcel then presents a more positive kind of description and is a more, I said, optimistic kind of existential thinker. Incidentally, his work seems to be followed by an American historian of the movement, James Collins, who taught at University of Washington. Washington University in St. Louis, I beg your pardon. Washington University in St. Louis, James Collins, who criticizes Sartre for assuming that there are just two modes of being, pour soi and en soi, and that these are antithetical. Says James Collins, this postulate is just unjustified. Descriptively, there is so much more than that, so many more modes of being. So that kind of complaint. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who after Sartre became sort of passé, Maurice Merleau-Ponty was the most distinguished French philosopher in the, I would say, in the 50s, the 60s. He rejected Kant's view of the self as only intentionality. That is to say, he was willing to accept Husserl's description of the intentionality of consciousness. But the thing that Sartre does in the book you're reading, The Transcendence of the Ego, where he denies any transcendental ego and reduces the self to simply that which I create by the act of intentionality, again and again and again. That's what Merleau-Ponty repudiates, because it eliminates the subject of the subject-object relationship. So that if there is no subject pole, there can be no relationship. You see, there can be no object without a subject. And just from that phenomenological standpoint, he wants to maintain that there is at least some personal identity, some continuing personal identity that isn't simply being created over and over again. And so he tries to do a closer phenomenology of other aspects of the subject-object relationship, and particularly, as far as Merleau-Ponty is concerned, perception, the phenomenology of perception. He has a whole book by that title, The Phenomenology of Perception, and what becomes known as the lived body, bodily experience. You notice how Sartre talks of erlibness. Erlibness, isn't that the way it's spelled? Yeah, lived throughness, lived experience. Well, what Merleau-Ponty is trying to argue is that our lived experience, concrete experience, is lived bodily experience. Lived bodily experience. And whatever more there is to self-identity and to the nature of the self, that at least, that lived body that is given in experience is something with enduring identity. And so he's not satisfied with reducing it all to simply the act of intentionality. Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Following Merleau-Ponty, the leading figure in French thought, Paul Ricoeur, in the 70s, and I suspect on into the 80s. He's still alive. Retired. I suspect he's about 80 by now. Paul Ricoeur. I think I mentioned him before, did I? French Protestant, Reformed tradition. He has been very interested in a phenomenological hermeneutic. That is to say, interested not just in a philosophy of existence. No, he's gone beyond the existential concerns. He's not an existentialist. His is more of a general phenomenology. But he's interested, therefore, in a hermeneutic, in the interpretation of various aspects of human life. What do we make of the voluntary and the involuntary? How are we going to interpret the experience of freedom? What about the phenomenology of guilt, which is obviously going to be significant in terms of moral objectivity? The phenomenology of language. So what he has done is to try and get at the essential structures of these aspects of our being in the world. Our language, our sense of being free, our sense of guilt, of finitude, so forth. And has done some sterling work in those regards that have involved him in critique, for instance, of Freud on guilt, of the structuralists like de Saussure on language as simply artificial structure superimposed, Paul Ricoeur. And then I note Paul Tillich, not in any sequence with the three previous ones. Paul Tillich, Protestant theologian, whose approach to theology has really involved a phenomenological method. He has a book, for instance, a little book called The Dynamics of Faith. The Dynamics of Faith, which is a phenomenology of faith, which he calls an ultimate concern. So the act of faith is a centered act in which the whole being comes into unity in its intentionality towards the object of faith. And as far as phenomenology of faith is concerned, it's a very helpful, very enlightening sort of study. He has a book called The Courage to Be, which is another way in which he talks about faith. So he does a phenomenology of this existential courage in contrast to the lesser kinds of courage, you see. And if you look at his massive 3-volume systematic theology, about which somebody has said it's the only theology in which there are no biblical texts, what he is doing is a phenomenology of the human condition, so as to pose the existential questions. And then what he does is to address the heritage of Christian thought to those existential questions, you see. He calls it a theology which answers those questions. In that sense, an apologetic theology. Apologetic means, of course, means, of course, one which speaks to the existential questions. So it's the phenomenological account which poses the questions. And he does that in a sort of Heideggerian fashion, like Heidegger's Being and Time.